So what we're going to do today, we're going to talk a little bit about code ownership, because this is a question that comes up frequently, the question I frequently get asked from students. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Then I want to pick up with doing some more work with APIs. So you guys did the world's easiest lab last week using the Facebook API. We started building the Recaptcha API on our registration page, but we're going to need to look at how to interpret the results we get back from Google so that we can tell whether the users successfully clicked on this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to build our own little API using PHP and Json so that another application could query our database and display the results in their own application. So we'll see how long that takes. We might do another exercise with API building. We might do Lab 5 today. We will kind of play that by ear, see how the time goes. So one of the questions that I get frequently from students is, particularly I get from students in this class after you've finished assignment 2, you've handed in this content management system. So the question that students ask me is, well, if I go out and use this content management system, now let's say somebody wants me to build a website for them. I built this content management system, so I want to use it. The question is, who owns it? So Chad meets somebody who has got a business, and they say to Chad, hey, you know, you're a computer student, do you think you could build a website? And Chad says, yeah, you know, I've got this system. So you agree on a price. Let's say, you know, you're going to make a couple $1,000s for building out somebody's website. You want to use your content management system. So the key question is, who owns it? And how do you figure that out? Does Chad own it, or does his client own it if they pay for the website that uses Chad's content management system? Or do I own it because it was all my idea? What do you think?
But no. Well, your code is generally like pretty vague, right? You're just modifying it to suit what you need. So you own like the backbone, but then everything you put into their content for their websites.
Okay, so you'd say the content is the client's, but the code would be the developers. What do you think?
It depends. If you sell the program, they own it completely. But if you sell the service, you own it. This is your code. You're selling the product, it's theirs. Okay, that's a really good point, right? That as a content management system, what you probably want to do is, in effect, you're licensing it as a service. So they're going to pay you not only to set it up, but they're going to pay you on an ongoing basis to maintain it, right? But in that case, who owns it? So under your scenario, I own it.
Right, you as the developer would still own it, okay? So this is something you want to be really clear about. We talked probably a couple months ago about having a contract before you do any development. So in any kind of development, you need to be really clear who owns the code. Now, do you always own the code if you do all the development? No. So can you give me a scenario where you would still write all the code, but where you wouldn't own it? There are a few different scenarios. Man, you said no right away, so can you give me an example? Where the client owns the code and you don't own it?
Like sometimes people do sell their code, so.
Okay, so that's an important point. That's a good way of determining who should own it. If the really big question is, who has the right to resell the code? That's really how you can figure out who should own it, okay? If Chad builds a content management system and uses it to build a website for somebody, the idea is Chad's going to keep ownership, basically, as Fred said, as a service that he could resell it and build 5 other websites using that same code base, and he could get paid each time. Just because you build a website for one person doesn't mean they could take your code and then go and build other websites for somebody else. So that's a really important point you raise, Mayank, is who has the right to resell it. Okay, so what would be a scenario? Could you think of a scenario where your client would have the right to resell the code, even though you were the one who wrote it?
But like, if we sell our code to somebody, so now they can sell it to somebody else if they want to, because it's not our code anymore.
Okay, so if someone comes to you and says, I want to buy it from you, you could choose to sell it. and then they would have the right to continue selling it. That would be one scenario, absolutely. Can you think of any other scenarios where you would still get paid as the developer, but the right to resell it wouldn't belong to you, it would belong to maybe your client?
Working for a company and you write the code for a company, but the company is the one that has the right to resell it.
Absolutely. Okay, so you're employed as a salaried employee for a company. Just because you work on a project doesn't mean you can then take that and go outside and sell it to somebody else, for sure. What about, though, if you're still doing freelance or contract work? There would be a scenario where you work directly for a client, but they own the code and you don't. And they would be the ones that have the right to resell it. It's not uncommon. Anybody think that what that would be? Well, I could show you an example of one. If I could think about so an application like this, we wrote all the code here. However, that works well. All of the logic and all of the content, who do you suppose developed all the logic and content and all the intelligence in the application? Whose idea was this? What do you think, was ours as the developers or was it our clients? Right, it was our client system. They already had this whole system. They were just doing it on paper. So they paid us to implement it electronically, but all of the logic and feedback and results and reporting that comes out of here, it's not our idea, it's not our intellectual property. They simply paid us to code it. So in this case, they have the right to resell it. And in fact, this is a resold version. They sold this to another company, and there's now two sites. They have their own original site and the version they sold. So even though my company wrote every line of code in this application, we don't own any of it. We don't have the right to take it and then go and resell it and get paid for it. Our client has that right. Okay? So it's really important when you agree on a contract that you figure this question out ahead of time. Whose idea was this? Okay? So in the case of something like a content management site, well, that's your idea. You're building it, you're in effect selling it out as a service. So you have the right to sell it to as many people as you want to, and you have the right, you own that code. They don't have the right to take it without your permission. Okay? In an example like this, where it's a custom application, and there's all kinds of custom logic that your client developed, and they're simply paying you to implement that logic, that's their code. Even though you wrote it, you don't have the right to then go take it and try to sell it to somebody else.
Is there any entity that you can go to register your code? Like if you write a code and you want to register so nobody can take it, is there any or not?
Well, there's a few things that you can do, okay? One of the challenges with building applications in PHP is that all the source code is directly in the PHP files. Right? This is one reason why, if you're licensing the code and keeping ownership, it's best if you can host the sites yourself, right? If your client hosts them, well, they have your source code. So it's very difficult if they want to take it and resell it, it's very difficult for you to stop them. Okay? Using some other technologies like using ASP.NET, your source code is actually compiled. So only the compiled code goes on the server, so even if the client has access to the server, they only get the compiled version of it. They don't get the raw source code files. Now, occasionally you will have somebody who will ask you for access to the source code. You've probably seen software before where you can either buy an end-use license or you can buy a source code license. How do those usually differ in price? So if you want the same piece of software, one is just software you can use, and one is software that also includes the source code. Are those usually the same price?
No, this one is more expensive.
Yeah, usually which one's more expensive?
The one with source code.
The source code version is usually 2 to 3 times or 5 times more expensive. So if somebody says to you, if you agree you own the source code, that it's your application, but your client wants access to the source code, make sure you offer them, I'll give you the source code version, but if the application was 10,000, the source code version is 30,000. They're not probably going to ask for the source code version in that case. You want to keep ownership of it when you can. Okay. And I've had clients before say we wanted the source code, and I've said to them, well, you've paid for a user version. You've already paid for that. You have access. But if you want the source code version, here's the price. And when you pay that, I'll give you all the source code. And usually they say, no thanks. They don't want to pay for it. Okay. So it's very important in your contract, in the terms and conditions down at the bottom, you need to specify who owns what. Do you own it all and they're just paying as a service? Does the client own it all and they have the right to resell it? And in some cases, it could even be both, where there's a split. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're asked to build a custom application like this, that your client already has the intellectual property to, it's their idea. But on the front end, on the public website, you figure they need a content management system. So you want to use your content management system. And I've done this with many different applications. So same, here's another custom one that we built from scratch. All of the logic and everything that runs in here is all custom and the client owns all of it. Except the front end is much like your assignment. These pages are just our content management system. So we said very clearly in the contract, all of the custom stuff that happens, all of the data and analysis that happens for users who pay and subscribe, the client owns that, they can resell it, they can do whatever they want with it. However, the content management piece is ours, and they can't go ahead and resell that piece. So if they wanted to resell this entire system, we'd have to have some negotiation. If included giving away the content management system, well, either that new client needs to pay us for the content management system or we have to figure something out. So our contract very clearly says what the client owns and what we own. Okay? So this is not a conversation you want to have after you've spent time building the application. You need to clarify this stuff at the beginning, who owns what. So this would go for your content management system, if you built a shopping cart, if you built an event scheduler, if you build anything with an idea, hey, I could resell this to more than one company. I'm going to keep ownership of this code and sell it to as many different clients as I can. You want to be really clear when you sell it to one client, look, you're paying me to use this, but it's mine. But if I do something custom, yes, it's yours, and I make no claim to it. Okay, so that's something you want to figure out before you spend your time building something and not later on. Okay, any questions, comments from anybody? No? Okay. All right, so what I would like to do is to finish our registration. So I'm going to make a copy of last week. I'm going to make a copy of last week's application, dump it in a lesson 12 folder, and work from there. Okay, you can grab the files off of, I can't remember if I put them on GitHub or if the files are directly on Blackboard. So the file is either on there as a zip or there's a link to GitHub, I can't remember which. For those of you who came in late, so we did this, let's see, last week, that was lesson 11. So here are your files if you want them. So my schedule did change again, so we are back to our original schedule. So our exam is not next week. Our exam will be in 2 weeks. We'll have a regular class next week. That class will include some exam review, and we will have Lab 5 either this week or next week as well. Okay, so the exam will be in 2 weeks. I thought originally I was going to have to cancel that class, that I'd be away, but I will still be around. So I'm just going to grab my folder from last week. Dump it into a lesson 12 folder. And I'm just going to change my htaccess file so that it points to the proper path for lesson 12. And I'm going to re-upload everything into a lesson 12 folder for today. So now I can load the exact same application. Everything still works. We did last week with our column sorting. And on our register page, our CAPTCHA shows up. So the thing we haven't done is our CAPTCHA really isn't wired up to check. This generates our code. But it's not actually checking whether the CAPTCHA is valid or not. So we want to fix that. So the page that we need to deal with is our save registration page. So I'm going to open that one up. So we started putting our CAPTCHA check on. We applied our secret key value, which I generated on Google and put on Blackboard. And we also have a response value that basically will indicate whether or not the user checked the I am not a robot box. So what we need to do next is we need to pass those values to Google's Recaptcha API, and that API will return some kind of response to us that we're going to need to interpret. So, which is really silly, I can't believe they haven't updated this yet. In their code examples, they give you a link to GitHub, and when you go to GitHub to look at the code examples, even though they just updated this, all of this is actually using version 1 of the API. So they give you PHP code samples, how to call and parse the response, except it's for the old version of the API, which we're not using anymore. They have yet to update this. I don't know why. I think Google probably has the resources to put somebody on this. Maybe one of you guys should do it after this lesson. You can say, here, hey Google, why don't you update your documents so you can actually show people how to read version 2 of your API. So verifying the user response. So we're going to send in the reCAPTCHA response. So we're going to send it to this URL, and we're going to pass in our secret key and the response. We're going to ignore the remote IP because it's optional. We don't really care what the user's IP address. This is what we're going to get back. we're going to get a JSON object which will look, if the user successfully checked the box, they're not a bot, it's going to say success, true. If there's an error, either with their response or we put in an invalid key, we're going to get back a false value for success, and then we will get back a nested array, a subarray of error codes that will include a code and a description of what the user did wrong. So we should probably talk a little bit about JSON. Have you guys worked with it at all in any of your other classes yet? No? Okay, so we should probably take a couple minutes and talk about JSON a little bit. This is the first, certainly not the last time you guys are going to encounter it while you're here. What is JSON? First of all. Anybody know what it stands for?
JavaScript object.
Right, so it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. JSON is basically an array in JavaScript format. Okay. Can you think about why this would be a popular format for exchanging data between different applications? We said last week that's what an API was, right? It allowed two applications to talk to each other. So this is typically the standard, become the standard format on the web for exchanging data between one application and another.
Can be done in any language.
Well, that's one thing. Virtually any language or platform can both generate code in JSON or read code in JSON, right? So we don't even know what language the Google API is. We don't know. This could be Java, it could be C#, it could be something entirely different. Could be JavaScript, could be anything. But whatever they're using for their API, we know it can create JSON, can give us a response. And we know our PHP can interpret JSON. In fact, if we just do a quick search for PHP Json, built into the PHP language, we have Json Encode. Take a string and represent it as JSON, JSON decode. So we're going to use those functions. So we can take text, convert it to JSON, or we can take a JSON object, convert it into text. There's functions built into PHP. Pretty much any programming language under the sun nowadays has similar functions for reading or writing JSON. Okay? So that's one reason. Pretty much any language can use it. Can you think of any other benefits of why JSON is really good, particularly on the web, for letting two applications talk to one another and send data back and forth?
Is it something related to serialization where an object can be sent?
Could be.
It's easier than XML.
Okay. So XML was the old standard, right? All applications, not only can they speak JSON, they could also speak XML. So why? It's basically replaced, or in the process of replacing, XML. Let's have a look at why. Well, John, do you have any idea why we would use JSON versus XML? We can look at two samples for a minute. We can look at the same data represented as an XML document and then represent it as a JSON document. So let's say we had a list of users. Okay, so this is what that list might look like in XML. So we have a users tag which represents the whole collection. Then we have an individual user tag with each property. So that would be a sample of what it would look like in XML. Here would be a sample of the exact same data represented as a JSON object. So some APIs actually still give you the choice. Do you want to send and receive data in XML, or do you want to send and receive data in JSON? But more and more this is becoming the standard. If you looked at the two of them, what would be the benefit that you could see of the JSON version?
Easier to read and less memory.
Okay, for sure it's easier to read. It's got spacing, first of all, which the XML doesn't really have. Why would it be less memory? You're right, this is much more lightweight, which means it's going to get transmitted and interpreted faster. How can you tell this is going to be faster than this? there's something in this document that this one doesn't have. Yeah, so we still have the opening tag before each value, but in XML we've repeated those tags. So if we look, so this is only 2 records, right? Which isn't a lot. So our XML document, 691 total characters. Our JSON document is 494. So 200 characters less. That's with only 2 records. Imagine there's 200 records in this. 2,000, 200,000, 2 million. Think about the difference in terms of memory usage and time, performance-wise, to transfer that data back and forth. It's huge. Okay? So JSON is going to be lighter weight, it's going to be easier to read, and it's going to be faster. The other nice thing, because this is JavaScript, it also means we can read it directly in our browser with things like jQuery. Well, jQuery is JavaScript, right? So to generate this kind of data from a client event using jQuery or Ajax, or to be able to read this data, is really simple. Okay? And in fact, I think in the Google API documentation, we're not going to use it, but they even suggest using an Ajax request, which is JavaScript. So our page doesn't even have to reload to interpret the API response. Okay? So you guys will probably be working with JSON quite a bit more. In fact, I think next January, you guys have your advanced web programming class. That whole class will probably be basically a JavaScript class. There's a good chance that will be Node.js, which is JavaScript on the server. Well, in Node.js, all of the data, usually it doesn't even use a relational database. All of the data is just stored in JSON format. Just stores all of our data as JavaScript arrays, which means it's really fast to pull data out and show it in our application, really fast to take it from our application, save it, because it's in a native JavaScript format. So more and more of our APIs, they used to look like this, and now they look like this. In fact, if we looked at the API we were working with, I was showing you last week, just go down here, we can actually see how they do it, interestingly enough. Where would it be? Support. If we look at their API documentation and look at some of their methods, I know we took a quick look at this last week. So let's say we want to get a list of users. So they have a user list method. So here's how you'd call it. You'd make a request to that URL. And notice one of the parameters we would pass in is what format. We could actually specify, I know it's hard to see, we could request a CSV, we could request XML, or we could request JSON. Their API would give us that data in any format we want, whatever works the best on our end. So here's the sample in JSON, there's the sample in XML. So those were the 2 samples I just showed you.
What is CSV?
Comma separated values. So basically just commas. Each row is on one line in it's a text file where each value is separated with a comma and each value is on a new line. So it'd be easy to import into a program like Excel. So if you wanted to, or to import it into a database. So they actually give us the choice when you call this API method. How do you want the data? We'll give it to you this way or this way or this way, whatever you want. So CSV and XML is getting phased out, and more we're using this. So this is what Google's new API is giving back to us. So we needed to spend a couple minutes figuring out what JSON is, because that's what we're going to get back when we call the Recaptcha. So we need to know, how do we interpret that value? So I put some of the code in here. Do you guys have this comment block in green? In yours or no? In your files? Okay. That's fine. I'm actually going to take that out. We'll go through it. I'm going to take out these comments. Now, Yash, you asked a question about using the CURL function last week. We're going to use it. Okay. So CURL lets us make a call to a remote any website and interpret back a response, but it happens behind the scenes. We don't actually take the user off to that. They don't see that page in their browser. We're going to keep them on our page, but we can send our data to Google's URL and read the response back without the user seeing any of this stuff. It's like a hidden post or a hidden GET request. Okay? So what we want here is I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to take this stuff out. We'll do this one at a time. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to create a variable called URL, and we're going to hard code in that variable because that's the page we have to send the request to. That's Google's verification page. So we'll just create that as a variable. The second thing we're going to set up is an array we'll call it post data, because when we call the URL, basically we need to do a post. Now, normally when we've done a post, we've built a form and we've let the user type in the values and click submit. In this case, it's a hidden post. The user doesn't see anything. So we need to pass the secret and the response in our post to that URL. So now we'll fill in these two values. So we're going to create a value in our post called secret and set it equal to our secret variable here. So that will include our secret key when we do the post. And in here, we want to pass in our response. Okay. So we're going to do a post to that URL, and we're creating an array of all of our inputs.
Couldn't we just do that in one statement, where you give an equal to an arrow?
Yeah, you could. There's different ways of doing it. So I'll put in a comment. So add the two values to include in the post to the Google API. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. So then we want to initialize the request to the remote URL. So we're going to initialize, we're going to initialize, use the function CURL. We're going to call a remote page. So we're going to initialize it. We're just going to create a variable. So then we're going to add a bunch of options to our URL request. Oops, sorry. So we've got this CURL set option. So we're going to take our existing request and we're going to pass this in as the URL option. So we have some different options. So the first one is, what page are we calling? So we're calling our URL variable from up here. We then want to set an option for return transfer, meaning we're going to read a response from our URL request and keep the user here. We're not taking the user somewhere else. And we'll just put in a value of 1 for true. Or we could put in true here, doesn't matter. We also now need to include our post data array. So not only are we calling that URL, but we want to include our secret and response values when we call that URL, because we need to send those two values to Google. So the third thing we want to say is we're doing a post request. So we can specify a get or a post. In this case, we want to post those values to Google. So we're setting the option post to true. And now we want to add our array of post data. And then we'll execute the post request and get a result back from Google. So we call curl exec, and that actually executes the request. And then we'll have a variable which comes back that will be a JSON array with some kind of response we got from Google. So this is how we can make a request and send data off to another URL without taking the user there. So perhaps this might be a credit card authorization. We get the credit card number, name, and expiry date, and the amount. We just use CURL in PHP to send those values off to a credit card gateway, and then we read the response back. We don't take the user to a different page, we do it underneath, just in code. And then we can close that request. So we can see what's here, what we get back from this request. I want to evaluate this, so there's a couple things here I want to do. Let's comment out our execute. While we're testing this, we don't want to keep saving new users. We'll just interpret the response we get from the API, and only when it's working will we actually save a new user. So I'm going to comment out this line, my execute line, so it won't actually save the user to the database. Let's get the API check working first. Once it's all working, then we'll put in the save back. We'll put the save back in. So let's see where we get so far. We're not done yet, but this should at least allow us to call the API, and we can try and see what we get back. So let's upload our save registration page. And make sure you're in your lesson 12 folder, not your lesson 11 folder. So if I click on that and try to register, So that's what I got back, success true. Now what happens? So here's what gets returned back if I don't check the box. Success is false, and I get a missing input response back from Google. I could also break it this way. Let's say I put an extra character in my secret. So I'm sending in an invalid key. So if I go back, even if I check this off, I still get success is false because it says my secret is invalid. We don't really care what the error message is. We're primarily interested in this value. Right? We need to know whether success was true or false. So I'll put my key back to how it was. Any questions so far? I know that's quite a big block of code, but we had to add all of it at once in order to try it out. If we leave any of these things out, then we're always going to get a false response from Google. We need to set all these things. This URL, that our return transfer coming back to our page, that we're performing a post, and that we want to pass in the secret and the user's response to Google. Does anybody have questions about anything that's up here so far?
Is the default get?
Good question. I believe so. Why don't we try? The best way to answer that question, let's try it. So if I take out that it's a post, we can see whether it still runs or whether I get an error. I've put the proper key back in. You want to have a guess? What do you suspect will happen?
Is expecting post.
Okay, well, it still took true, which is interesting because I'm pretty sure in here it does call it, oh, that's a post from our form. Okay, so it can do either. So the post is not absolutely required, even though we're better off because they say post, right? The documentation says that method takes a post. Now, I don't know if I specified it as get, whether this would work. Let's try it. So the default must be post, because when I use get, it doesn't respond. So technically that line, I guess, is optional. So on a normal form, get is the default. With CURL, looks like post is the default. So if you don't specify it, we'll do a post. Does anybody else have a question about what we've done so far to make that call to Google? So if we get this value, now we need to interpret it, right? So what we need to get at is we need to find the key called success, and then we need to read the value. So in JSON, so in XML, they look like HTML tags with an opening and a closing tag. Everything in JSON is simply key-value pairs, right? So we have a key and we have a value. Very similar to how on form inputs we have a series of keys and values, or query string values, right? We have keys and values that way as well. So we need to interpret the key called success, use the key called success and find whether the value evaluates to true or false. Now keep in mind, this is a JSON array. It's not considered a string, so we can't just search it like it's a string for the word true. We're actually going to need to decode it from JSON first. So we are going to decode the result that's in JSON format. So I'll just create a variable called obj, standing for object. So what we want is to decode our result. Now there are a couple of optional parameters here we're going to play around with. We'll need to play around. So by default, we'll try it like this. And then let's just echo out our object variable. John?
Shouldn't you do a print R because you can't echo an
Yeah, you
array?
can.
Okay, yeah, we should do a print R. Sorry, can you explain exactly the difference between print R and echo? Yes, you're right.
Print R recursively prints out each part of the array, as echo states the string variable.
Okay, you know what? We will want to use print. I'm going to use, actually, you know what? Let's do both so we can see the difference. So echo it and use the print R function. And we can see how they differ.
Yeah, I think echoes will give an error.
Well,
It's a string to array conversion.
let's try it. So if I just repost it, 149. Yeah.
Print R is a method, isn't it?
Yes, thank you. Print R is a method. Actually, I'm going to put print R first because I think you're right that echo. We'll try it like this and see what we get. Okay. So our print R loops through and gives us this success equals, but we didn't get our value. Notice, it doesn't say false here. And our echo actually crashed. It says, so this converts, the JSON decode, it gives us back an object. Echo expects a string, so it doesn't know how to, doesn't understand that that's a string. So there's a way around this. Notice in these parameters, when I say decode, by default, it says associative created as an array is equal to false. If we set that equal to true, we're going to get a different result. Then we're actually not only decoding the JSON, but we're converting it back into an array. Then we can read elements of the array. So I'm going to add the true parameter. And notice now it says array rather than, so our echo didn't crash, but it still says array, right? We can't print a whole array. How would we access one element of an array? We could use the index, or we could just use the name of that element in the array. So now we could try it this way, right? The key is called success. So let's try and print out the element of our array called success. So by using true, it now converts it from an object to an array. So there's a few steps involved. Decode the JSON, send it to an array, and then find the element in the array with the name success, the key success. Let's try this.
If success is false, it's in PHP it's registered as 0 and it may not print anything. Right?
Actually, we'll try one thing first. I'm just going to comment out the print R. We may have to use this. I'm going to try it with this function. Let me just try it. So after we decode, it might be one more step involved. So now it gives us false. And now we get true, although this is printing to the screen. Let's try it this way. Okay, I think we'll just have to play around with this value. This is showing me what I want to see, but we'll have to think about how we evaluate it. John, you have a suggestion? Okay, I think here's what we'll do.